In 1969, Robert Winters was a 78-year-old retired logger living in Oregon. He was a family man, he loved the outdoors, and he really loved going hunting with his three sons. In early October 1969, Robert and his three sons headed off for their annual hunting trip that they would do at Sparks Lake. Now, Sparks Lake is an area that they had been hunting for 20 years. They know this area inside and out. They arrive at Sparks Lake and they set up their camp right at the base of this mountain that was a part of the area that they would be hunting in. And for the first couple of days, everything was going great. On October 8th, they found out that there was this big snowstorm coming in later that night. They still wanted to go hunting that day, so they decided that instead of going up into that mountain and hunting up there, they would stay at lower elevation around where their camp was. So the four of them split up and they took up different positions all around this lake, but they're all in the same general vicinity, and they all hunt for the day, and then they all come back to the campsite that night. Except Robert didn't come back, and as it got darker and the snow started to fall, his sons got really worried and they went out looking for him, but quickly saw that we got to get other people involved in this because this snowstorm's coming in and we don't know where he is. So they call the sheriff's office. The sheriff's department launches this massive search right away, but unfortunately, over the first 24 hours, not only did they not find Robert or any sign of where he was, but over 18 inches of snow dumped all over the area. Because of the snowfall, it made searching the area on foot really difficult, so they called in a couple helicopters to scour the area from the air. And it was at this time that one of the helicopters picked up tracks at 7,100 feet right near the lake. And the tracks were actually discounted, and people said that can't be Robert's because that would mean he would have had to go up almost 2,000 feet in elevation when he and his sons had all agreed we're not going to go higher because of the snow. And Robert was an accomplished outdoorsman that would know in an emergency survival situation, especially in a cold environment, you don't go uphill. Temperatures drop as you go uphill, risk of hypothermia increases, plus you're burning more energy trying to get up a mountain. So they said that cannot be Robert's tracks. 5 days after Robert went missing, no sign of him has been found, and the search was terminated. 9 months later, a doctor was on vacation in the same area near Sparks Lake, and he discovered next to a tree up around that area where those tracks had been found by the helicopter at 7,100 feet, he found lying against a tree a rifle, some clothes, a boot, a glove, and a pair of glasses. The doctor informed the sheriff's department, who came out and confirmed that these all belonged to Robert Winters, but oddly enough, there was no blood anywhere on the clothes. And there were no bone fragments or any remains anywhere in the area because they brought searchers out and combed that whole area. So there was no indication that Robert had actually even died. Even stranger was it looked like the clothes had been removed on purpose. Everything was stacked neatly next to this tree. The only other new piece of evidence that we would ever find about him is a year later, his dentures were found in that area. So again, there's no remains of Robert, just his various belongings that were found in that area. The family wanted to move forward with funeral arrangements, but they needed the coroner to sign a death certificate. The coroner refused for over a year, saying there's no sign he actually died. But eventually the coroner said it's also impossible for him to be alive at this point, so they were able to get a death certificate even though there was nothing ever found of him. It seems very unlikely that Robert, who was a skilled outdoorsman who had hunted this particular area for 20 years, and had agreed with his sons that it was a bad idea to go up in elevation because of the storm, defied all of that and went almost 2,000 feet up in elevation, removed his clothes neatly and put them on the ground next to a tree, and then vanished without a trace. But then how do we reconcile those tracks that were seen from the helicopter up near where all of his belongings were found? Unless those tracks weren't Robert's. On February 19th, 1999, Dr. Catherine Wong, who was a pediatrician in San Jose, California, she was 47 years old. She and her husband, John, along with two relatives and two of their three kids, drove 4 hours northeast from their home in Milpitas, California, to Bear Valley Ski Resort. The family loved to go skiing any chance they could, so Dr. Wong was actually a fairly skilled skier. This would be their first time at Bear Valley Ski Resort, which is a resort located about 30 miles south of Lake Tahoe. The Wongs arrive, they start skiing, it's this beautiful day. At about 11:30 in the morning, everybody stops and goes into the lodge for lunch. After lunch, their kids and the other relatives decide to stay in the lodge for a little bit longer, so Dr. Wong and her husband John decide to go skiing on their own. And at some point, Dr. Wong and John decide to go down separate trails. John goes down his trail, and Dr. Wong would go down her trail, which was not a difficult trail. It's one she'd been on earlier in the day, and she doesn't show up at the bottom. John's down at the bottom, he's waiting for her. After a little bit of time, he starts to think, okay, maybe she got hurt, maybe she fell down, I'm not sure. He starts making his way over and looking up the trail. He can't see anything. There's no indication that someone's been hurt. And he starts looking for another 20-30 minutes. Can't find her. Ski patrol goes up and they're looking for tracks coming off of the trail, a sign that maybe someone fell off and went into the woods. But there's no tracks anywhere of somebody leaving the trail. So the ski patrol gets in touch with the sheriff's office, who come out and launch an absolutely massive search. But by the end of the day, there was no sign of Dr. Wong, and even more strangely, they had searched all 75 trails on Bear Valley Ski Resort, and there was not one indication that someone had skied off of any of the trails or even walked off any of the trails. The search continued for another 2 days, no sign of Dr. Wong. They began reviewing all of the security footage, and any instance where she was on camera, there seemed to be nothing wrong. At the end of that second day, the weather got much worse, temperatures dropped, and this huge snowstorm rolled in, and the folks in charge of the search decided it was too dangerous to continue. Plus, at this point, they believed that it was impossible for Dr. Wong to even still be alive. At this point, they told the family that they are considering Dr. Wong deceased, and they terminated the search. It was around this time that newspapers and people in the area began to speculate that this was not an accident, that either Dr. Wong willingly decided to vanish or foul play was involved. There was no proof of either one, but it just seemed so bizarre that there was this massive search and there was just no sign of her anywhere, no tracks, no anything. It just felt like something's amiss here, we just don't know what it is. Her husband John ended up taking a lie detector test, which he passed, and investigators began digging into their marriage a bit to see if there was some underlying problems. And it looked for all the world like it was 20 years of a very stable, healthy, happy relationship. There was no sign that Dr. Wong would be looking to, escape her life and run off with someone else. 4 months after she went missing, her remains and ski equipment were found about a half-mile south of the ski resort in this deep ravine, heavily forested, well off any marked trail. Bone fragments and remains were scattered over a quarter-mile trail along this ravine. This area had not been previously searched because when they initially launched the search for her, this area was so steep and so difficult to get to, plus there was 8-foot snowdrifts from the ski resort all the way to that area, that they decided it would have been impossible for her to get there. So how did she end up in this impossible area, and why weren't there any tracks leaving the mountain? Some say the scarcity and dispersal of her bones over that quarter-mile track indicates that after she had been deceased, animals had kind of ravaged her remains. Others say that an animal is responsible for this attack, and that's why her remains are scattered over a quarter-mile track in this impossible area. But what kind of an animal is able to sneak up and grab a person off of a very populated ski resort and drag them this half-mile away without leaving any tracks or raising any suspicion? In 1991, Corey Fay was a 17-year-old high school student in Beaverton, Oregon. On November 23, 1991, Corey and 2 of his friends decided to go elk hunting. Corey was not an avid hunter, but he went hunting enough that he was competent, and he had taken survival training and was always very well equipped anytime he went out on a hunt. So the 3 of them load up in a truck, they make their way out to this hunting site, and when they get there, they decide to split up and meet back up at the truck at 6:30 that night. That night at 6:30, the other 2 hunters came back to the truck, but not Corey. He was nowhere to be found. The other two hunters briefly went out looking for Corey and they couldn't find him, so they called the sheriff's department, who comes out and they launch this absolutely epic search. They had helicopters, they had horse teams, they had 250 ground searchers. They had 7 of the world's best scent sniffing dogs in the whole world are a part of this search. In over 10 days, that group covered 12 square miles where Corey would have been. Towards the end of this 10-day period, when this all-star search team has come up with nothing, people began to wonder if the other 2 hunters had accidentally shot and killed Corey and maybe buried him. But those search dogs never found a gravesite. The official search was called off on December 1st, but many volunteers stayed out for weeks and weeks, combing the area, going well beyond the bounds of that initial 12-mile area they searched, and nothing was ever found. The sheriff's department that was in charge of this search was so perplexed by the fact that this amazing team of searchers couldn't find anything that they ended up contacting the FBI, which indicates they were suspecting foul play, because that's the only reason the FBI would get involved. But almost nothing happened in Corey's case for nearly a year. In September of 1992, 2 hunters were hunting about 10 miles away from where Corey had gone missing, and they discover a rifle, a backpack, and a jacket. They don't know whose it is, so they turn it over to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department comes out and they're able to confirm that they all belonged to Corey Fay. A new search was ordered right around that area where his belongings were found, and all these searchers came out and did a grid search, and all they could find were a couple of bone fragments and his tooth. No large bones, no rib cage, no skull, nothing. And interestingly, they also never found his pants or his boots. But now that they had some of his remains, the sheriff's department was looking at where they were found and looking at the time of the year when he had gone missing, and they realized that to go from where he went missing to 10 miles away, 3,000 feet up in elevation to where some of his remains were found, he would have been in waist-deep snow for over 5 miles. People were skeptical about him making this trek because it didn't make sense, but his family in particular really didn't believe it. Corey's grandparents said in an interview that Corey had taken these survival courses that he would talk about all the time, and one of the main things they teach you is in a survival situation when you're on a mountain, in particular when it's cold, you never go up. If you go up in elevation, temperatures will drop, the risk of hypothermia increases. So for him to have wound up 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation is basically doing the opposite of what he was trained to do. And his grandparents said that Corey was incredibly level-headed. There's no reason that in a real survival situation that he would have just thrown that out the window. He would have relied on his training. So the million-dollar question is, why are his belongings and bone fragments 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation? Did he defy his training and go there on his own, or did an animal attack him and drag him there? But if it's the latter, what kind of animal drags a 17-year-old, his rifle and his backpack 10 miles up 3,000 feet of elevation in over 6 feet of snow? And where is the rest of him? All we ever found were a couple of bone fragments and a tooth. So like all of these missing 411 cases, we're left with a lot of unanswered questions, because that's the whole deal with missing 411. These are baffling. But that doesn't stop us from speculating about what could be happening. And not only will I respond to the early commenters, I'll also pin the best theory at the top of the comments section. If you want to learn more about Missing 411, please check out David Paulides' book series called Missing 411. I provided a link in the description below where you can purchase those books. Also, David Paulides has a YouTube channel that I provided in the description below as well. Go over there, subscribe, and check out his content as well. I also have a Missing 411 playlist that anytime I do any episode like this, I put in there, so you can check that out too. If you enjoyed today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a Coke, but secretly give it a Pepsi. Also, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct noon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Sue Licia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Sue had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Sue, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Sue really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains, and in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Sue was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Sue is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city, because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Sue herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Sue would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. I mean, this was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Sue was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Sue, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Sue sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Sue began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Sue was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Sue, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge. And she doesn't know what to do. I mean, it was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Sue stared at this guy, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Jia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle, and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, no way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way. But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle, and it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, hey, I'm sorry for offending you. But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you. She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless. And this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, there's something sincere about this guy, and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up, and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following this stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything, it totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him, Gia followed her in, and the two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing. And Sue is kind of asking general questions about it. But, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia, and suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go, and she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black. A couple of weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now, nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Gia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports. But candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex-working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Gia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place, and it's the same city and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1991, so 2 months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, oh, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was like no information. Like there was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha, because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I have a highly addictive personality, and in my life, it's been both a blessing and definitely a curse. When I'm focused on a goal, I become totally addicted to it, and as a result of that, I usually accomplish that goal. But when I don't have a goal to pursue, I often turn to alcohol kind of out of boredom, and then that becomes a very unhealthy addiction. It usually starts with a drink or two with my wife over dinner, totally harmless. But very quickly, I spiral and begin hiding alcohol around the house and drinking by myself in the garage secretly at like midnight after my family's asleep. And invariably, my wife always finds out eventually, and we have the same talk every single time where I promise her I'm never going to do it again, but the cycle always continues. However, this month, with the help of my therapist, I finally decided enough was enough. For my family, for myself, I have to be sober. And so far, sobriety has actually been kind of great. Granted, I'm 3 weeks into the process, but I'll tell you, this time it feels permanent. And I really attribute that to working with my therapist. They're really a big part of the reason that I saw just how destructive alcohol is in my life. So if deep down you feel like you do have some big change you have to make at some point, really consider giving therapy a try, because I'm telling you, their perspective, which you don't have, is the thing you're likely missing. They're able to show you what's going to happen if you don't make that change. Obviously, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I'm telling you, it's a great starting point if you're in a similar position to mine. And a very accessible therapy option is a totally online therapy platform called BetterHelp. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey online, and then you'll be quickly matched up with a licensed therapist who will listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you right from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or select MrBallen during sign up to enjoy a special discount on your first month. By late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse, because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances, all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Gia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again, a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes, and he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up, and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, two other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform, and they manage to stop all three of them, and they turn them around, and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags, and they contain drugs. And so right away, these three know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there, and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, "What are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here?" They're not talking. And so finally, the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Jia Wang. The same Jia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Jia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Jia, Jia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Jia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting. And he offered them a blanket and said, "Here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay." And that just totally broke this person. And they said, "These drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Jia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible." The next day, a phone rang in the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, and it was one of the officers who interviewed these three people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Jia's house, and he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Jia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time, and felt like her reservations about Jia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Jia's house, he wasn't home, there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there, and the smell was so strong. But they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs, and when they got down there, they couldn't see anything. It's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something, and they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Gia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drugged tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Gia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. And then suddenly a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people, dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit that were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Gia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Gia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively, and he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. And so Gia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of his basement. A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Gia for the first time, but this time she was alone. And she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it. And before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Gia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads into the front door, she opens it up, she brings the man inside, the door shuts, they take their shoes off, and Sue leads this man into the kitchen where Gia is waiting with a wire between each hand. And as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Gia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck and held it until the man passed out. And then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming the man on the ground and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her, and then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people, and she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this.
Like she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him. And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs. And they stopped them and they got them back to the station, and one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station. Nobody knew she was missing, and she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there.
2009, a fit, healthy 30-year-old man named Alex was at home in San Diego watching TV in bed. At some point, he noticed there was a slight pain in his left Achilles tendon. A tendon is the fibrous connective tissue that connects muscle to bone, and the Achilles tendon is the biggest tendon in your whole body, and it's the one you can feel on the back of your ankle. It connects your calf muscle to your heel. Alex had never had tendon pain before, and so he assumed it must just be tightness from the long walk he had taken that night around his neighborhood. And so after massaging it for a little while, eventually he kind of forgot about it and just kept watching TV until he fell asleep for the night. The next morning when Alex woke up, he immediately recognized that the pain in his left Achilles tendon was 10 times worse. It was blindingly painful. And then his right Achilles tendon was also now starting to hurt. And so he reflexively reached under the covers and tried to massage his sore tendons. But as soon as he touched the backs of his legs, he felt shooting pain in that area. And so he couldn't touch them anymore. And so instead, he swung his legs off the bed and he sat up on the edge of his bed. And then he slowly rocked forward until he transferred his weight onto his feet and tried to stand up. And as soon as he did, he fell to the ground because of the blinding pain in his tendons. And so he manages to pull himself back up using the bed. And then he hobbles his way out of his bedroom over to the top of the stairs. And then he grabs the railing and he carefully makes his way down the stairs. And as he's walking, it feels like the tendons are so tight, they're going to snap like a rubber band. And so he gets to the bottom of the stairs and he walks his way around into the kitchen, where he sits down and he kind of evaluates what's going on. And he thinks to himself, man, I must be developing a wicked case of tendinitis. Tendinitis is inflammation or irritation of the tendon. And so Alex grabbed his laptop, which was right in front of him. He opened it up and he began looking for ways to alleviate pain from tendinitis. And so after looking at a couple medical forums, he got up and hobbled his way over to the bathroom. He opened up the medicine cabinet and he grabbed the Icy Hot, which is a topical pain reliever. And then he hobbled his way into the first floor living room where he laid down on the couch, and then he applied a healthy amount of Icy Hot on the backs of both of his legs right over his tendons, and then he propped his legs up on 2 pillows. And so he laid there and he's thinking, okay, so it's the weekend, I have today off, I'll just lay here until the pain subsides. But by that evening, the pain had not subsided, it had gotten progressively worse. And so Alex picked up the phone and he called a podiatrist, which is a doctor who specializes in feet and the lower half of your leg, and he made an appointment for the following morning to have a look at his Achilles tendons. And so after he hung up, Alex thought to himself, the best thing I can do is probably just go to bed. I'm bound to feel better in the morning. And so Alex hobbles his way back up the stairs, holding onto the railing, and he goes into his bathroom to wash his face. He reaches for the towel and he notices his thumb is suddenly locked up and he can't move his thumb. And then his other thumb too locks up and he's looking at them and he can't get them to move. And so with his other fingers, he tries to move that thumb and bend that thumb, but he can't do it. The tendon in both of his thumbs had suddenly become unbelievably tight to the point where he couldn't move his thumbs anymore. Up until this point, point, Alex had convinced himself that whatever was happening with his Achilles tendons was probably minor, that with or without medical intervention, it was bound to just get better. But now he wasn't so sure, because the thumb situation, that really scared him. He had never experienced anything like that, and he couldn't help but think that whatever was happening in his thumbs was probably what was happening in his Achilles, making this a much more complex problem. So Alex forgets about washing his face or even going to bed, and instead leaves the bathroom and grabs the railing and hobbles back downstairs. He makes his way into the kitchen with the stiff thumbs, and he sits down at the table, he opens up his laptop, and he begins looking for any information about what is happening to him. A few minutes into his search, he was about to type something into Google when all of a sudden he felt the rest of his fingers start to lock up. The tendons in his fingers were tightening up, just like his thumbs and just like his Achilles tendons. And so now Alex is going into crisis mode. He doesn't know what's happening to him. He has no idea what to do, but he manages to calm himself down, and he told himself, Alex, tomorrow you got a doctor's appointment. They'll know what's wrong with you. They will fix this. Everything's going to be just fine. And so despite his overwhelming urge to panic, he closes his laptop and he hobbles his way over to the stairs. He climbs up to the second floor and he goes directly into his bedroom, crawls in bed, and he goes to sleep. The next morning when he woke up, the tightness and pain in his Achilles tendons and in his hands had not gotten any worse. And that kind of comforted Alex. He's thinking, okay, we're past the worst of this. I just need to figure out what this is and then fix it. And so he crawled out of bed, he hobbled his way over to the stairs, he went down, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he went outside to his car to head out to his doctor's appointment. When he got to his car, he reached for the door handle, and when he pulled on it, he felt an unbelievable surge of pain in the hand that was on the car. And when he looked down, all of the joints in that hand that had been pulling on the car, they had all separated. Like the connective tissue that kept his finger whole was no longer strong enough. So Alex screamed and he retracted his hand in horror, and when he looked at it, the joints had gone back to normal, but the pain in this hand persisted. And so on adrenaline alone, Alex managed to use his other hand and got the car door open. He went inside, and then he could barely grip the steering wheel because one hand is now wrecked and his other hand is not much better, but he managed to speed to the doctor's office. And then when he got inside, he could barely fill out the paperwork because one hand was wrecked and the other wasn't much better, so he couldn't grip the pen. But after he gave them his paperwork, the doctor finally came out and they brought him back to an exam room, and that's when Alex explained that originally it was just his Achilles tendons. That's why he had called for this appointment. But after making that appointment, not only had the pain in his Achilles gotten much, much worse, but there was also now pain and tightness in his hands, including one hand that had just fallen apart when he tried to open a door. Alex told the doctor that he had never experienced anything even remotely resembling this in his entire life. He led a very healthy lifestyle and really had no idea what could be causing this. Although he did say 10 days prior, he had finished a round of antibiotics. The drug was called Cipro, but previously he had used this drug with no issues. But as a precaution, he told the doctor because he knew one of the side effects of this drug was tendon problems. And so as a precaution, Alex had actually brought the paperwork for that drug, Cipro, and he gave it to the doctor. And so the doctor, after hearing the story, he reads through the fact sheet of this drug, and he tells Alex that he doesn't think it's a side effect of the drug. He thinks Alex is showing all the signs of having an autoimmune disease, like lupus or multiple sclerosis, and that he needs to go to a rheumatologist and get tested for that. And so Alex is horrified by this. He can't believe that only a couple of days ago, he was totally normal, and now it felt like his whole life was falling apart. And so he left that appointment, he went out to his car, and he called a rheumatologist, and he set up an appointment for a couple of days later to get tested, and then he went home. And over the next couple of days, as he waited for that next appointment, his condition only got worse. Every muscle, joint, and connective tissue in his body was either extremely tight or hurt or both. By the time he made it to the rheumatologist's office, he could barely move on his own. After the doctor had run several tests on Alex, Alex began mentally preparing himself to be told that he had an autoimmune disease. He believed at this point that that was the most logical explanation for what was happening to him. But when the test results came back in, to Alex's shock, he was negative across the board. He did not have an autoimmune disease. And so Alex hobbled out of the office, he got out to his car, he sat down, and he was in pain and at a loss. He had no idea what was happening to his body, and it seemed like none of the experts knew either. And so when Alex got back to his house, he made his way into the kitchen and he sat down to do some more research, but he felt like he was at a loss there too. He didn't even know what to research. He had searched for every possible combination of pain, tightness in your Achilles, pain, tightness in your hands and your fingers, and nothing was lining up with his experience. And so he thought to himself, even though that podiatrist ruled out the antibiotic he had taken a cycle of before he started feeling the way he was feeling, even though he ruled that out, I might as well do some more research on it because it's the one thing I can point to that was newly introduced to my life before I had all these things happen to me. And so he opened up his laptop and he typed in Cipro side effects. And what he discovered horrified him. Cipro is part of a class of antibiotics called fluoroquinolones, and while it is a very effective antibiotic, it comes with extremely severe side effects. And enough people who have taken a fluoroquinolone have suffered from these side effects that there's actually a term given to them. They are said to have been floxed. And as Alex discovered in his research, there are many online communities for these floxed individuals, many of which used to be healthy and fit, but after taking these drugs, they became bedridden or had to transition to a wheelchair. This is due to one of the nastiest side effects of this class of drug: ruptured tendons. As a reminder, a tendon connects muscle to bone. And so if you were to say a tendon has ruptured, what you're actually saying is the muscle has torn off of the bone. And apparently this is unbelievably painful and almost always requires surgery to fix. And in many of these floxing cases, the fluoroquinolone drugs cause these people's tendons to start dramatically tightening until they just start rupturing. And there's nothing they can do to stop it unless they stop moving, hence becoming bedridden and transitioning to wheelchairs. When Alex read all these horrible testimonials of people who had been floxed, he realized their experience mimicked his own. He was floxed. But once he knew what he was up against, he began looking for a timeline. How long would he have these symptoms for? And what he saw was most people experience these awful symptoms for about 3 months and then they fade away. So for 3 months, Alex suffered, but he stayed positive. He was certain he was going to get better. But 3 months came and went, and he didn't get better. In fact, he got worse. All of his tendons continued to tighten, and some of them ruptured, and he had to quit his job and had to move in with his parents. But he stayed positive. He went back online, and he began reading about more severe floxing cases, and he saw those people typically saw a big turnaround at the 3-year mark. And while that was overwhelming and awful and disheartening, he at least had something to look at as the light at the end of the tunnel. And so for 3 more years, he waited and waited in pain. He eventually became completely bedridden and completely dependent on his parents. But then the 3-year mark came and went, and much like the 3-month mark, nothing got better, he just got worse. And that was when Alex realized he was in the range of people that suffered from their floxing permanently. In 2016, so 7 years after taking that fateful dose of Cipro, he wrote a blog post on his website updating the world about his condition. In it, he says he's only gotten worse and that his life effectively came to an end in 2009 when, over a 6-day period, he swallowed those 12 Cipro pills. And so now all he looks forward to is his death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that,